The king shook his head, Wind howled again, and King saw a spear blade behind him cut through darkness of the night. King's horse took off and rushed away along the road. Then leaves fell from the sky. There were so many of them that dust swept among the crumpled human bodies. King looked up. Several more of the same tornadoes were flying towards him from the east. He saw a crowd with scythes in front of him, only the majority had scythes, and some even had spears. Everything is frozen here. This dragon squad formed a circle to meet the attackers. King saw next to him a small hunched figure in a blue robe. "Bumble," said the king, "so it's you. And I thought that an army of skeletons was coming at me again. What do you want?" "Allow me, my lord, to make a speech before your face," he said, "and I will prove my loyalty to you. This vile world, created by you for universal horror and disgust, has been trying to die for thousands of years." "I don't need to hear this," the king said, "death has already happened." "Try it." "What?" the king asked in astonishment. "The element is leading me. I myself am the element. Tell me, Lord, do you want the wind to blow your coat of arms here one of these days?" "I don't understand you," he whispered. "How can this huge book of winds make you think like that? Do you know the laws of fate? Who knows what will happen tomorrow? We live today." And the king, thinking, fell into silence for a long time. It should not be forgotten that this was not a mere mortal. He tried to listen to him, but it was all in vain. He finally understood. What was original cause of the bumble has now become its elemental element. It's like splitting an atom, he thought. The harder the blow, the stronger the split. This is undoubtedly a symbol of my doom. It was cold horror. It didn't last long. Soon, consciousness returned to him, and he felt free. The further he went, the clearer the sounds became. First, it was a breath of wind that came from afar, as if from a distant seashore. Soon he could already distinguish individual sounds, and finally, their sound flew to his ears, a horse neighing. Their horses made their way through the darkness with difficulty, snorting anxiously, sometimes falling on their hind legs. He had a torch in one hand and a spear in the other. "What does he want?" asked one of the companions and turned away from the rider. Irritation was heard in voice of the first one. "Is this a mockery? Let him answer." Other two said nothing in response and also turned to the side. The other two riders also dismounted. Their horses wearily rose to their feet and swung their front legs several times in the air. Then the first one said something and waved his spear. "Scared, of course, I was scared, it's no joke, 3 at once." The skulls smeared with mud and fat hardly instilled fear in him. He didn't try to run away. Then he squatted down and covered his face with his hands. On the contrary, rather, he was afraid of his tears, so sometimes he leaned his head against the snow and hid in it up to his ears. And Bumble was still sitting in his snowdrift and crying. For some time nothing happened behind him, and then a distinct clatter of hooves was heard behind him. He had large and very beautiful eyes, full of tears. Then he stood up and brushed the snow from his knees. Now he knew what to do next. It was a beautiful morning, at least as far as the snow was concerned. Otherwise, everything was terrible. Snow was falling, snowflakes were falling, but he kept walking and walking. Soon the snow ended. It became hot. It became dark. He began to freeze. There weren't any lights around at all. and it was very scary to walk. Near the path stood a tall iron gate with a human face painted on it. And then someone opened the gate. It was the same man who helped Bumble up. The man helped Bumble enter and led him along the path. The man stopped near a large tall house, raised his hand and began to ring doorbell. Bumble ended up in a huge dark room with a low ceiling. Voices and music could be heard from the next room. He was about to turn around and go out into the street, when he suddenly saw a door in the wall from which music was coming. It was quiet, and only from behind one door came some indefinite noise. Apparently, music was playing there. He slightly opened the door and saw a stage in front of him. It was all filled with round chairs on which people were sitting. Bumble noticed that on every chair, except for one, there are albums, and next to them are glasses with something that looks like tea. Then he noticed a man sitting at a table with two thick wine glasses on the table in front of him. Then he knocked again. The man extended his hand and Bumble gave him his invitation card. The man read it and hid it for several minutes. He peered into the rows of those seated, trying to guess who they were from faces of his neighbors. Finally he understood everything. It was a very interesting back. His muscles moved with such ease, as if he were holding very thin needles inserted into hollow balls. Bumble got used to it from the time when he was engaged in singing, and therefore did not notice how the newspaper fell out of his hand. And suddenly, when he had almost ceased to distinguish blows of the rumble, there was a short crack under his feet, and he realized what was about to happen. Then he figured out that this is what they are made of, and the rubber was just glue that holds rubber together with air. He felt nothing but that rumbling sound coming from the auditorium. But after a while, he began to think that this was not always the case, and realized that the sound arose when he was at the stage. The sound intensified, and he thought he could distinguish words that were repeated from one to another. He tried to make sense of it, but the words disappeared as quickly as they appeared, and he realized that they were a chorus of something unknown. He stood very straight, as if he had just been cast from bronze, with a square face and closed eyes. Then he heard a few words that he had heard before. It was short and meant explosion. When he realized what was coming next, the meaning of the second became clear. Explosion meant decomposition. Everything is for destruction, Bumble repeated to himself. He felt that everything around him was failing somewhere. Then he realized that he was falling into a black hole at once. An unimaginable roar arose around him. But explosions and roar were ahead. He seemed to be floating in the void. In the center of the black spot, he saw a dark core, from which something like shapes of sparks emanated. These sparks looked very strange. There was something like a void between them. Gradually, this void began to grow. At first, Bumble noticed something like metal ribs, on which fiery gold and some blue sparks broke. But the coins were of different sizes. When the coins were very small, they were almost like toys, but when they got bigger, they became huge. Sometimes they were black and sometimes bright red. Some seemed to be on fire, some were still, and some were moving. They moved, looking into each other's eyes. It seemed to wake them up, and then Bumble realized that these coins looked like robots. He knows all their feelings, knows how their voices sound. These are his real feelings. Then Bumble decided to throw one of the coins at Mac. Bumble moved closer. Mac saw it. Bumble saw that a small fire seemed to flare up in his chest. The coin disappeared. but the fire remained. The fire in Mac's chest grew brighter. It was as if a large drop hit the center of that fire. A coin with a red spark fell towards the fireball. The coin with the red spark disappeared into his chest. The coin with the red spark. Bumble couldn't gather his breath. But just a minute ago, a living person was a corpse, and now he was lying in the grass, and his features were strangely recognizable. Mac raised his right hand and pointed to someone in the sky. But Bumble couldn't make out who exactly. Mac was very close to this speck when a small, barely visible airplane appeared from the sky. Then this spot became smaller than a pea, but it became clear that it was an airplane with a tiny fuselage made of white paper. Bumble felt this tiny dot slowly crawling towards him. All the colors of the world faded, because at that moment the plane had the last leg of its journey. There was no one else beside him. When he ran up, the king, wrapped in a wide cloak, looked at the strip of sky on the horizon. Mac also looked there. Mac felt fear and annoyance at not being able to see any part of what was going on down there. But the king turned his face towards him and said, "Mac, don't leave me. We should be together. We should be together down there. Let's go. I know what to do." He realized that the king, ignoring his words, would go on his own, as if they were going for a walk. And Bumble had no idea. He descended a few meters below the king and walked beside him. King had already moved far from the city, and there, on the hill where the airfield stood, one of those strange creatures appeared. As it approached the king, Mac could see it. It was a long-winged serpent, whose head just started at the level of the king's face. The serpent let out a low moan and twisted. The king looked at Mac and pointed to the snake. The winged serpent crashed into Mac, but before he had time to fully stick to him, the king cut off his head with one swing of his sword. All that was left was a long smoking sword, on the hilt of which there were two figures, a large and a small one, and a tongue curled into a ring stuck out of the hilt. He remembered that the big eye was alive and still alive, so there was more to be learned from it, so Mac wasn't about to destroy it right away. They licked and licked until Big Eye's head popped out of the big eye. Mac turned away and walked away. Before his eyes, the burning sword was still standing, which, flying up, went out, but it became light again. And yet, the shiny ball disappeared from Big Eye's eyes. Mac breathed a sigh of relief. Now it was time to rest. Mac picked up speed. Soon he realized that he was getting closer to the target. At first, Mac thought he was circling in circles. Then it became clear that no, the jungle was moving. Mac started slowing down, and then decided to run. Perhaps he was not in danger. If he could see the sky, he would hardly be seen from here. But if the jungle hadn't moved, then he should have flown away. After a while, Mac noticed that he was already in the thick of the forest. The wind was blowing from one side. On the other hand, there was an edge in front of him. I had to fly with the wind. It smelled of grass and mushrooms. A couple more steps, and Mac came up to her. Mac stopped and saw who he was looking for. Before him, a man lay on the ground, covered with mushrooms and moss. He held a wooden sword in his hand. Grandfather was surrounded by a strange, vibrating aura. Mac became frightened and backed away. The world around has changed. It has become different, and now Mac no longer saw Grandfather in front of him. Then his legs became brittle, and his body began to fall rapidly. Mac wandered down and crashed into the nearest fly agaric. he, as before, felt the vibration in his fingers and toes. He realized that he was simply discovering something in himself that neither he nor anyone else could explain. Now he felt it with his whole body, and saw what none of the former senses could see. After the fall, he found himself in a completely different world. Through the rare gaps in the trees, mountains were visible. One of them tried to get into his brain and take out some of the elements that made up his new world. All of a sudden, everything changed. Everything around disappeared, only the bare ground with withered grass remained. And this knowledge was nothing like the one he had once known. Alien thoughts could not get into his head. And, as if having heard these words, his body was sucked into a narrow tunnel running along the very edge of an alien universe. Everything is gone. All that was left was the cold wind blowing through the open window. And it was summer again. And it was morning again. And everything repeated, morning, wind, window. And then Bumble came to him. For some reason, he didn't come alone. There was another man in black with him. The prophet pointed the object at Mac and said something. Mac, without waking up, felt the receiver pointed at him. He felt that what he was reading was written by someone else. He was no longer Mac, but he hasn't fully woken up yet. It stood right in front of his window, so big and bright that he knew it was a dream. But it was actually morning outside. But Mac couldn't wake up. He felt sorry that he did not have time to go outside. He began waving his hands in farewell, and suddenly a colored robe fell on him from somewhere above. The woman in the window has disappeared. Mac woke up. We need to find Bumble. In case of danger, run away from the house without stopping or looking back. Mac was suddenly overcome with despair. Finally, he realized what it was, the enchanted rope that had tied him to the bed. Bumble appeared on the threshold. Bumble held a bucket and a rag in his hands. He approached Mac and began to take off his blanket. Bumble took out a brush from the bucket and began to diligently smear it. He inserted it into the lantern, pulled the switch, and all the lamps in the room flashed brightly at once. He covered the lantern with his hand, went to the door, quietly opened it, and looked out. He stood on the stairs for a few seconds, listening, then went to the window and looked out. It was dark all around, and the moon gave no light at all. Bumble reached the edge of the roof and carefully jumped down. After flying a few meters, it fell to the ground and rolled over several times. It was dark and quiet here, but Bumble walked slowly and carefully. After a few minutes, he found himself in front of an iron grid. Soon he went out into another courtyard and noticed the edge of a small summer kitchen lit by a reddish light. Climbing over it was also easy. Several apple trees grew there, and just below them was a small patch of road leading into darkness. As he watched them, the two shadows disappeared. So they were in the courtyard. Now he was very close. No body was felt. Then he saw a dim reddish light shining from the window onto the ground. With a strangled cry, Bumble lunged forward. The luminous figure stopped. Bumble charged at him, and the two grappled and rolled on the ground. Bumble looked up and saw a man sitting on the ground next to him. He was a strange type, not at all like a local resident. His face looked stern, almost ascetic, although he had neither a mustache, nor a beard, nor smart glasses. Apparently, that was the star, because when he turned to Bumble, there was a large round metal star on his forehead. A satisfied smile played on his face. I see you're not as dumb as you look. Why didn't you just say so? Come on, shoot, Bumble. Why did you call here? Bumble told, and Mikhail began to laugh. When Bumble was already completely confused, Mikhail took him by the hand, lifted him from the ground, sat him down next to him and said, "Do you even—" Mikhail leaned over and said softly in his ear, "That's not entirely true. After death, bad people go only to hell." Mikhail thought even harder. There are special people for this. Do you know who they are? And Mikhail did not immediately answer this question. He nevertheless decided to find out who it was, and just in case he asked, "Do you know who it is?" Bumble looked at him suspiciously, as if hoping that Mikhail would say something else. But he remained silent. But taking a step towards the exit, he turned around and asked, "But how do they eat in hell then?" Bumble realized that this meant little to him, and went home. Before his team, he had not heard anything about the hellish realm. It turned out to be very difficult. He kept forgetting what he was thinking about. He understood that in his spiritual state he had already fallen into hell. Suddenly it dawned on him, what if he doesn't have a spiritual state at all? What if it's just a hallucination? And then he realized that it was all about his leg. After all, it was just a deception of himself, and he himself understood that he really did have his leg. He had just got out of bed and went to work, and suddenly there was such pain. Then there was a snap of the joints, and he doubled over in pain again. He knew his leg was broken before he knew it. After several minutes of terrible agony, he realized that he must have died. This time, he fainted in earnest. Finally, he did stop and heard someone say something to him. It turned out that he was lying in a puddle on a dirty street. It turned out that she came because she felt a change in him. It turned out that the grandmother was invited to the funeral. Then she said again that it was all over now. Then she said that you can talk about anything, and turned off the light. True, she very beautifully kissed him goodbye, and he remembered her beautiful voice. Somehow, he woke up in his bed a completely different person. Still, life didn't interest him much anymore. For a while, he thought he'd lost his mind. But then Mac came along. Only the first mind thinks this way, because until this mind becomes an empty shell, where all the dirt and blood of the world flows, its life will always matter. In principle, they are all similar. These dreams are life. Dreams are life. End of sleep. End of the game. Thank you for being there until the end. Until the end of the dream. Until the end of this game.